We're now a few months into President Joe Biden's presidency, and so far, the president has signed a stack of executive orders, which have been mostly focused on handling the pandemic and reversing many of former President Donald Trump's policies. And his executive order that protects LGBTQ rights under federal law has become a big talking point online. Take a look at this clip I found on YouTube.
On just day one of his time as President of the United States, he has signed an executive order on, wait for it, gender identity, preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. But Abigail, what does this really mean?
Well, the plain text of the order, what it means is that it spells the end for girls' sports.
But does Biden's executive order really affect girls' sports in this way? It's time to find out. Is this legit? Hey guys, it's Lauren. If you're new here, we walk you through the steps on how to fact check viral YouTube claims, plus give media literacy tips that you can use on your own. If that at all sounds interesting, consider subscribing so you don't miss any of our fact checks. Okay, let's get into it. So the executive order we're talking about today was signed on day one of Biden's presidency, its goal being to prevent discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation, and to prohibit workplace discrimination in the federal government. While the executive order was generally met with a lot of praise online, some conservatives heavily criticized the order and started using the hashtag Biden erased women. Several tweets included quotes from Abigail Shrier, the woman being interviewed in that clip I just showed you. Now, if you're familiar with our fact checks, you'd know that oftentimes the best place to start your research is by taking a look at who's sharing that information. This clip is from a show called Outsiders, a conservative political commentary show that's part of Sky News Australia, a 24-hour satellite channel based in Australia. I also did a keyword search to find out more about Abigail Shrier and her book that was referenced, but I couldn't find a whole lot. I found this opinion piece from the Chicago Tribune, which stated that most major newspapers declined to review her book. I also found this Vice article which details that when Joe Rogan hosted Shrier on his podcast, some Spotify employees called the episode transphobic and demanded it be taken off the platform. So I'm going to keep all that in mind while I fact check this. But where do girls' sports come into play in all of this? Let's head straight to the source and read the executive order for ourselves. So here it says that children should be able to learn without worrying about whether they will be denied access to the restroom, the locker room, or school sports. The order also cites Bostic versus Clayton County. I did a keyword search to find out more, and according to the Washington Post, this was a Supreme Court decision which ruled that all gay and transgender employees are covered under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of '64, which prohibits discrimination because of sex. Basically, the court ruling held that it's pretty much impossible to discriminate against a person for being gay or transgender without also discriminating against them based on sex. And according to the Post, the order essentially calls on federal government agencies to review their policies that prohibit sex discrimination and update them as needed to clarify that sex now includes sexual orientation and gender identity. So while the executive order doesn't specifically mention anything about girls' sports, and definitely doesn't say anything about ending girls' sports, after watching the video, Shrier's argument is essentially that if you allow transgender girls to play on girls' teams, they would have an unfair physical advantage. Take a look at this next clip from the video.
That's exactly what the purpose of the executive order was. It was to warn states and schools that if they didn't consent to the destruction of school sports, of girls' sports specifically, by allowing in biological boys, they would lose their funding.
To look into this claim, I did another keyword search. I used words like Biden to end girls' sports and funding, thinking it might bring up some fact checks. Instead, it brought up some articles with some pretty sensationalized headlines. This is a good lesson in just because it's at the top of Google doesn't mean it's the most reliable, which is why you need to use a skill called click restraint. Basically, you're going to want to restrain yourself from clicking on the very first article you see. Instead, scroll down the page and look for more reliable resources you're more familiar with. I wound up updating my keywords and eventually found this article from USA Today. According to the article, like I mentioned earlier, what this executive order does is build on the Supreme Court ruling that found that sex discrimination also applies to gender identity and sexual orientation. And Biden's order calls for the ruling to be applied more broadly, including Title IX. Title IX is the federal law that prohibits sexual discrimination in federally funded schools. And now to the issue of funding. Shrier states that this order was done specifically to warn states and schools that, quote, if they didn't consent to the destruction of school sports, a girls' sport specifically, by allowing in biological boys, they would lose their funding. In that USA Today article I found, it said they reached out to the White House for comment on this. Here's the response. The executive order does not tie an education institution's federal funding to allowing biological male athletes access to women's sports teams and scholarships. The order mandates that all students, including transgender students, be able to learn without facing sex discrimination, and as part of that, transgender women should compete on female teams. While Shrier claims that transgender female athletes have an unfair advantage in sports, USA Today pointed out that transgender amateur athletes already have policies they have to follow in order to compete. For example, when hormones are used, the National Collegiate Athletic Association requires 1 year of hormone treatment for trans female athletes competing on women's teams. And at the Olympic level, for people who transition from male to female, they need to demonstrate testosterone levels below a specific level before their first competition and then throughout the eligibility period. At the K through 12 level, policies vary, with some states requiring medical proof. None of these restrictions were brought up in the original video. Okay, now seems like a good time to recap. At its core, what this order does is make federal agencies review their policies that prohibit sexual discrimination and update them to reflect the Supreme Court's ruling that includes sexual orientation, gender identity, and discrimination. It is not true to say that schools need to allow biological boys on girls' teams or they'll risk losing funding. Instead, it says that they should allow transgender students to play on a team that matches their gender identity. That being said, this executive order does apply to federally funded schools. And federally funded schools who violate Title IX and put forth policies that discriminate against their students based on sex would be breaking federal law, and thus could be subject to some sort of consequence. But to be honest, I did a lot of research on this, and while a school could lose funding for breaking Title IX, it's never actually happened. So USA Today wrote that most of the posts criticizing Biden's order lack a lot of needed context, and I'd have to agree, which is why we'll rate this video as needs context. The video does not do a great job at explaining the actual order and fails to mention that there are actually already rules in place for transgender athletes at the collegiate and Olympic level. Thanks so much for watching. If you feel that you've learned anything, feel free to like the video, and remember, fact-checking doesn't have to be hard. Plug in some keywords whenever you feel unsure about anything, and of course, practice click restraint. See you guys next time.
Don't compromise, be MediaWise.